Hi, I'm Shannon Sorrow, and I'm pleased to be talking with a former student of mine who's also a school teacher who has worked with some of the materials that Fantails developed, both as part of her training and now in her teaching. And I want her to share some of that experience because often people have approached me with, well, what is it really like when you bring fan fiction into a classroom context, and does it work, and what are some of the challenges? So Heather, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and joining us. And can you introduce yourself a little bit, telling us about, your school, the kind of classes you teach, and the kinds of students that you work with?
Sure. My name is Heather Floros, and I teach 12th grade currently at high school in Harford County, Maryland. So I used to teach 9th and 12th, but this year I have all 12th grade, and I have everything from what we call CC classes, which are collaborative, cooperative classes taught by two teachers that are a mix of students who have accommodations for special education and students who are on grade level and above grade level, depending on the class choices they made for their senior year. And that class is called Literature, it's English 4, and it's called Literature for the 21st Century. So it's meant to imitate some of the types of writing that you would do in a introductory college composition course. So studying different modes of writing and short nonfiction pieces, things like that. And I teach AP Literature, which is all focused on literature and is meant to be a college literature course and prepare students for the AP exam. And then I teach some just on-level classes for English for the 21st century. So I'm all 12th grade all the time this year.
Okay. So by saying all 12th grade all the time, you're working with students in their final year of high school, moving
Yes.
on. And so they're about 17 or 18. Is that how old your students are?
Most of them are. And then I have many we might qualify them as super seniors because of some of the online learning last year due to the pandemic that didn't work well for many students, and they're back to repeat a year.
Okay, so they might be a year older then.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So among this wonderful cluster, you have implemented your own fan fiction sort of project. And I wanted you to tell us a little bit more about this project and why you chose to do it with these students.
Well, the first the first reason I thought about doing it was because of your class, and I just enjoyed it so much, and it made me think so much about my writing and gave me a chance to dig back into books that I liked, and I just found myself engaging on a level that is it okay to admit that I didn't expect to in my class? So at first,
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough.
it was just refreshing. I think it just wasn't your typical academic experience. I think is what I loved about it. So, and it was something that I was excited to try and do for myself, and I thought that that would translate well for what I hope for my students. So the idea of something that would have built-in motivation, this kind of air of novelty, especially for students who were repeating the year or who were really struggling, wanting to be done and struggling with the in-person, and just kind of a new twist on something that they might have done in the past. So, and I really like when I can find ways to help learning sneak up on my students. So I can tell them that they're going to learn from it, and they're like, oh, okay. But then that actually does, and it kind of sneaks up on them, and they don't realize at first what they're actually doing. And then just the idea that it hits so many potential standards and skills that I want my students to use, and they're using them in ways that are unique. So it's not something they can just copy or repeat. They have to make it their own so they can own it. which is a really cool thing and sometimes hard to bring about in the high school classroom.
So you're saying it aligned well with the curriculum, it sounds like, the learning goals that they had to achieve anyway. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you had them do? Like, what did this fan fiction project entail?
So it is a fan fiction research project. So one of the things they have to do is an extended research project. And it typically results in a typical research paper. And a lot of times you get pretty much just a compilation of different sources with very little student voice and well, it's very voice and I'm blanking on the word right now, but agency, I guess I could say. And so I thought this would be a great way to kind of remix the research project. So what I had them do is they had to write a fan fiction story, an AU fan fiction story. So they had to use an alternate universe. But the caveat is that the alternate universe has to be a historical time period. So they had complete, just carte blanche as far as what time period they wanted. But they also had to choose an important figure from that time period that they brought into the story. And they had to work specific quotes from that person's writing or speaking into the dialogue of their story. So, and I wanted them to have to integrate the sources into their own writing, which is a huge part of research, is being able to take that information and then pull it in various ways without plagiarizing and still keeping your own voice and style. So, and it was a way to kind of give them choice in a few different ways. They could choose their fan text, they could choose their time period, and they can pull in some of the other classes that they maybe were interested in. And then they can even choose and decide on a person who maybe needed to be highlighted or featured in that time period.
Okay. And I hear your dog in the background is just as enthusiastic about it.
And he loves it too.
Good. So I'm going to ask a question that I get asked all the time. So some people are often really skeptical about whether a fan fiction type activity really truly supports language and literacy development. And I was wondering if you could describe the learning experiences and learning outcomes that you saw emerging from this project for the different students you work with.
Well, one of the biggest payoffs, I think, is that students are engaging with text on many different levels. So they're thinking about their own writing as a reader and as a writer, and they're engaging with the text in that same way too. So they are experiencing it as a reader, but then also thinking like a writer, with, how does this writer do this, and how can I do this myself in my own story? But they're also thinking about, if they're writing for fans, what details do they need to pull in if they're writing for fans, or what if they're writing for other people who may not be fans? Do they need to explain things? And they're having conversations about their writing in groups and talking about what they're choosing and why they're choosing it, and they're running ideas by each other. And they're offering feedback and critique and giving each other suggestions. So they're reading and writing and speaking all about these different choices and connections. So it's just and she found her squeaker toy. You can probably see her tail going.
Yeah, I can. This is the best part.
Yeah,
of a Zoom session.
She starts to have an argument with her toy. So they're interacting on each of those 4 levels that you really want students engaging with language all the time, and it's authentic. So it's their questions that I'm gonna try to see if I can get her to.
Okay.
Did you? Okay. She might have gotten a toy that she can be the boss of for a little bit. So I got to work with students on everything from the structure of a story with summary, how to paraphrase, how to quote, how to punctuate dialogue, how to give effective feedback. We even worked in the idea of beta reading
Yes.
from the fan fiction world, and we talked about that. And we actually used, I found some guides that people who are beta readers created and shared with other fan fiction writers of things they could give people that are being their betas, and then people they can use if they are reading for someone else. So we worked that in. We created our own little fan fiction archive using Padlet. So there's just so many, there's kind of an unending list of possibilities of what I could do with it.
So this sounds like an incredibly rich learning experience with a lot of components. Do you mind if I ask, like, how much of the semester did you dedicate to this, and how much was in class versus out of class? These are just some details people often ask.
So we worked for about 4 to 5 weeks on this. Most of it was in class. I have found that, especially last year in our county, actually homework was kind of banned. We were not allowed to give outside work. And so coming back to class, outside work is not typically followed through on. It's just kind of a residual kind of effect from last year. So most of our work has been done in class. I allow them to keep working on it outside of class, and many students have chosen to do that, but this was planned in class. And we typically have class about 3 times a week. Classes are about 85 minutes long.
Okay. All right. That gives us a good idea. So it is a pretty substantial project.
It was a chunk. So
good. Well, since we're talking about the logistics, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about some of the challenges that you faced in implementing this, and how you overcame them.
So some of them I didn't overcome, but I have plans for how I will overcome them next time.
Okay.
So, I mean, the first thing was that my students were not quite getting the idea of fandom. Like, they weren't quite understanding all the potential ideas that they could have tapped into. They actually used some of the introductory ideas from the fan tales that we used for our class, and modified them a little bit. And we did the kind of thing where we chose, an object in a setting, and the students had a fantastic time with that. And then I chose some example AU historical fan fiction, and I had them use our rubric and kind of evaluate those and discuss those in small groups, and then we talked about them as a class. So I thought they got it, because I thought they were having a good time with it, and some students were kind of got it right off the bat, and they were already talking about things. And I was really excited, because some of these were students who had not had a positive reaction to anything we had done so far. And so one guy who, getting him to write anything is like pulling teeth, was gushing to, he would deny it, but gushing to his friend about how he was going to write about, a story where they go back in time and Tom Brady never plays football.
Oh.
And he was going to decide what time period that would be and how he was going to bring it about. And then he was going to can I flash back and forth? And he was talking about all of these things. And I actually could tell that he had listened during our narrative unit, because he was talking about some of the things we had talked about, even though he didn't actually write a narrative. So now he has a fan fiction one. And I think he ended up having him play football with Abraham Lincoln. I'm not sure. It's really
really changing history there.
Yes, he's really but so some students just got it, and then some students were really having a hard time. Just when I asked them, is there anything you're a fan of, or what do you really love to watch or do, or I just kept hitting that wall of nothing. I'm not really a fan of anything. I don't like, no. And even the digging questions, it's like, what's your favorite movie? I don't have a favorite movie. I was like, do you music, video game? And it was really just, they were just kind of almost on the offense. Like they did not want to do this. So I tried to show them different ideas. I tried to pull examples that used real people and video games and cartoons and all sorts of stuff. Sometimes I had to get them to go back to their childhood favorites, and that helped in some cases. So I think if I were to do this again, I think I would have spent way more time messing around with the idea of being a fan, and kind of get them maybe even to define it for themselves, and bringing in examples, and maybe have them mess with a few things that they're a fan of first before we even get into the whole project idea. Because I think some of them just kind of, they were either paralyzed by the possibilities, or they were just did not want to identify as a fan in any way. So one student was so opposed to it that he refused to do the assignment. So we just went to a traditional research format for him, and he was still able to do all of the things that we worked on. All of the lessons still worked. He was just not converting it into, I think he's missing out on the fun, but at least he was doing it. So that was a big thing that I really didn't anticipate. I thought students would just latch on and go, and some students really did struggle. So I might have even had a chance to maybe even get students to maybe record themselves using Flipgrid or something, where they just talked about their ideas and then had students go on and listen and like pick a few things to listen to of different ideas. That might help generate some ideas as well. The second biggest thing was the merging from fact into fiction. That was, they were stuck with that in some cases. So what I ended up having to do is, I had given them examples, but I really needed to stop and show them how it worked, like actually do kind of a think aloud, where, so what I did was I took, I was modeling the process for mine. So I chose Harry Potter, of course. And, and so I chose to have Hermione be in the 1913 with the big women's march before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration in DC, and be part of like women's suffrage. So because I used that idea of where she was fighting for elf rights, and I said, so I thought this would work really well. So what I did is I just took a couple of screenshots of some of the sources that I was using. And I had used a photograph of the event, and I used a couple of like someone, a historian who had a blog about the event, and then something from the National Archives. And I just highlighted the details that I was going to incorporate. And then I talked through and I showed them how I moved it from the fact into, and I showed them how I was going to paraphrase it, how I was going to use it to work it into my details. And I just kind of talked through the process and thought through out loud the possibilities and made the decisions, and then wrote it down. And then I made a copy of what we did, and then I gave it to them to reference. That helped, I think, in a lot of cases, so they could see that you could turn facts about who was there and what it looked like into description of your setting, or you could turn description of how the crowd was into possible dialogue. You just have to come up with the words that they might have been saying if it was a disgruntled crowd. And so I think that helped. So I definitely would have done more of that earlier next time, but that was a big thing for getting students over that that help.
Those are two really big areas that I'm really glad that you mentioned, because I know when I talk to people about fan fiction, often people will say, what about students who aren't fans? I
Mhm,
haven't faced the same degree of recalcitrance that you
mhm.
had, but I'm also aware that younger people maybe are more sensitive and self-conscious about disclosing parts of themselves, especially among other young people.
Yes.
Um,
I had one student who's a big fan of My Hero Academia,
mhm.
and he didn't want anyone to know that that's what he was doing. And it was a really cool, he had a really great idea, and he worked in like the Salem witch trials, and really was still true to the text, and but also came up with some really interesting ways of working in the historical information. But he just refused. He didn't want me to talk about it. He wouldn't let me share, because I try to always ask if I can share examples, and he didn't want to be identified as that at all. So which was really interesting. But he was doing it, and he had fun with it too. So apparently Winnie's having fun too.
All right. Well, we'll move this along so that Winnie can get your full attention in just
Yeah.
a moment. So I feel like you've shared some of the next question that I had, which was what students thought of this project. So it sounded like there were some people who were really into it, and others, like you mentioned, the one who
Mhm.
absolutely refused. So there was a mixed range of responses.
Yeah, I have to say that the majority were positive, and a lot of them were really excited about the idea once they got it. Um, it took a little, there was some hesitancy until they found their source text, their fan text. Once they found that, then they were all about it. So it was really
Mhm.
good. In fact, some of them were bemoaning the word limit. So, and I have 120 students.
Oh my
So
gosh.
yeah. So I was like, guys, okay, like, look, if you are off, if you can't stop and you just want to keep writing, okay. I said, but I can only read this much. I
Mhm,
said,
mhm.
so make sure you get all your requirements in by that point. I said, and then, because I had a student come in and say, oh my gosh, I had so much fun writing this, and my parents really loved it, and they were wondering what I was doing the whole time in my room, and I told them I was working on my homework, and they didn't believe me, and then I showed them. So I had some really good positive comments, and some that really, they're like, oh, I'm so glad I'm in this class because no one else is doing this, and this is cool. And then we had a few people who just are like, oh, I don't want to do
Mhm.
this. So I'd say that for the most part, the research part made people a little, that would be the biggest thing that they had a problem with, was they didn't want, can I just write a story? I
Uh-huh.
was like,
They
well,
wanted
why
to get
don't
to the
you,
creative writing first, and
right. So in those cases, I suggested, I was like, okay, just write your story first. So, which is another thing I might modify is
Mhm.
I actually had them research, once they had decided on their text, and they had we did a time travel day where I put together a lot of resources on just some of the different time periods. And I had them just kind of explore and jot down ideas about what time periods they thought might be cool and what might go with their story. And then I had them do some initial research first. But I think what I might do is maybe be a little more flexible about their process. So maybe they could write their whole story first and then find ways to work in the research. And for some students, it might work better for them to research first and
Right.
then write the story that comes about from that. So, and that's how it was easier for me to do it that way. And so that's how I kind of set it up. But I think going forward, I might give them the option of doing it either way. So,
Yeah, that seems like a reasonable response, because the creative process is a bit different. Not everyone approaches, even we see this in fans typically when
yeah,
they're writing. There's quite a range of approaches.
yeah.
So I have a final question for you, and it's really more about giving advice to other teachers. So if someone else is thinking about implementing fan fiction in their classrooms, do you have any final thoughts or pieces of advice for them?
Definitely try it first. do it first. And in fact, I would suggest even writing along with your students. Even if you have done it before, the process of writing along and being in the same part of the process with your students is going to help you identify issues a lot easier when you're in the midst of it, I think, than before. And it also kind of creates ready-made models and examples right there. You don't have to go that extra step because you're just in the process, and you can share those with them, and you can show how you're overcoming the obstacles in your project, and then they can translate that to their project. So I would highly recommend writing along with your students. Don't be afraid to make adjustments on the spot. And I would say don't be afraid to make adjustments for individual students. So one of my language learners, he's an emergent learner, and the research, coming up with a story and doing the research and trying to do all these, it just was too much, or at least too much for how much I knew how to help him. Perhaps if I approached it differently. And he's one of 30 students in my class, and there's not a lot of additional help outside for him. So he just wrote the story. And he based it on a movie. He's from Pakistan, and so he based it on a Pakistani movie. And we worked together, and we used the outline of the movie to come up with the outline of his story. And he just went from an outline, and now he has small paragraphs where he's filling in some details at the level he's at. And then, I have a few students who they wanted to do a time period where there wasn't any documentation of any writing, and they're like, how am I supposed to get a quote from this person? And I said, well, why don't you find, something that, where it talks about something they did or said or created, and then you can find quotes about that and work those into it, or find other people who we have documentation of things that they said and that would work for your story, and we'll work them in. And so, don't be afraid to modify things individually for students, and just to change directions if you need to, if it's not working. And then the last one is just really modeling, which would go along with writing with your students. Think aloud, read aloud with them, help them through the process. Because I think if you show them that it's not easy, but it's worth it, and if they see that it's not easy, but you can still work through the trouble, I think that's a frustration they're willing to go through.
I really like your think aloud idea. I think that addresses a concern I saw even with the Fantails group, where sometimes students really struggled. As you mentioned in your process, it was about going from research to the story. But for some of the students we had worked with elsewhere, they had not written creatively before. So it was even the creative process was how is this different from what I normally write? And so it sounds like a really great way to model your thinking as it transforms into the writing.
Yeah.
Okay, Heather. Well, I want to thank you again for joining us and sharing your experience. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you do next with this project and your next group of students.
Yeah, everybody just turned in their final draft, so I'm excited to read them. So
excellent, excellent. All right. Well, thank you.